welcome back to Mr. Dreadmere. Tonight, I have 9 true scary encounters from Blue Ridge Mountains, Appalachian horror stories, Mr. Dreadmere. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Mr. Dreadmere, you don't walk alone. I was standing ankle deep in the creek, shouting numbers into the trees while my notebook soaked through. And I remember thinking I needed to hurry because the light was fading and I still had 3 more cross sections to log before heading back to the truck. I leaned forward, planted the measuring rod, and called out, 0.42 meters, just like I had done all afternoon, my voice bouncing off the bank and coming back thinner. Before I could write it down, I heard it again from downstream, clearer than an echo, saying 0.42 meters in my exact voice, same pacing, same flat professional tone. I froze with the pencil hovering over the page. At first I told myself it was just the valley playing tricks, sound carrying weird along water, but something about it felt wrong. Echoes don't anticipate you. They don't come from ahead. I waited, heart thumping, then shifted 2 steps downstream and set the rod again. 0.38 meters, I said, slower this time. From farther down the creek, before my own voice could even fade, it came back to me. 0.38 meters. Same cadence. Same breath at the end. I remember laughing once, sharp and nervous, like that might reset reality. I told myself someone was messing with me, even though I knew no one had business being out there. This was grunt work, boring, isolated, and I had signed in alone that morning. I stepped out of the water, boots squelching, and shouted, "Hello." Nothing answered. The woods stayed quiet in that heavy way they get when sound feels absorbed instead of reflected. I told myself to finish the last readings and get out. Quitting early would look bad, and pride is a stupid motivator. But it kept my feet moving back into the creek. At the next cross section, I whispered the measurement under my breath, not even sure why. 0.45 meters. Downstream, just as softly, my voice whispered it back. My stomach dropped so fast it made me dizzy. Whoever it was could hear me even when I barely spoke. I yelled again, louder, "This isn't funny." The response came back instantly, overlapping my words, saying, "This isn't funny," before I had finished the sentence. That's when I knew it wasn't someone reacting to me. It was something running ahead of me. I packed up too fast, shoving the notebook into my bag and nearly dropping the rod. As I turned to head upstream, the creek spoke again, my voice calm and precise, listing measurements I had not taken yet. It called out numbers that matched the map in my head, points I knew I would measure next if I kept going. Hearing my own future thoughts spoken aloud made my hands shake so badly I had to sit on the bank and breathe. I felt exposed, like something had crawled inside my head and was reading from a script I thought was private. I decided to test it, because fear does strange things to logic. I thought of a number that made no sense, something I would never write down. I said out loud, 0.9 meters, even though the creek was nowhere near that deep. There was a pause this time, just long enough for hope to flicker. Then downstream my voice corrected me, firm and almost annoyed. Incorrect. 0.41 meters. That was the real depth, the right answer. I hadn't said it, but I had known it. I left the creek then, stumbling over roots, half running, half slipping. As I moved away, the voice followed along the water, keeping pace, calmly narrating what I was doing. Subject exiting channel. It said, using my voice but stripped of emotion. Elevated heart rate. Irregular breathing. I shouted for it to stop, but it only continued, describing me like data. When I finally reached the truck and slammed the door, the voice fell silent, as if it couldn't leave the water. I drove straight to the ranger station, hands white on the wheel. I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, and I could see the skepticism settling in their eyes. Still, They sent someone with me the next morning. We stood at the same spot, sun high, everything ordinary. I took the rod, my mouth dry, and said nothing. The other ranger called out a measurement instead. The creek stayed quiet, no echo, no voice. I felt ridiculous and relieved at the same time. Before we left, curiosity got the better of me. I leaned down and whispered a number I was thinking, one I did not write. The water answered, but this time it used his voice, repeating the number he had been about to say. He dropped the rod and stared at me like I had done it. We didn't finish the survey. The grant was reassigned, and the data from that creek was quietly marked unreliable. Years later, I still hear it sometimes, usually when I am working alone and thinking too clearly about what comes next. It never predicts anything important, just small choices, tiny measurements. I learned something there, though. Whatever lives in that creek does not want to scare you. It wants to know you. And once it does, it never really forgets. I was at the front of the line when we turned back toward camp, swinging my stick and feeling proud because I hadn't complained once. Mrs. Carter said it was a short hike, just a loop, and I believed her. When we stopped, she counted us fast, nodded, and told us to keep moving. I remember looking back and noticing there were 4 of us kids instead of 3. It didn't feel strange at first. We were always picking up stragglers. The new boy walked between me and Daniel, quiet, head down, wearing the same camp shirt we all had. I assumed he belonged. As we walked, I tried to remember his name and couldn't. That bothered me more than it should have. I whispered to Daniel, asking who he was. Daniel shrugged and said, maybe he joined from the other cabin. The boy looked up then, smiled a little, and said nothing. When we reached the clearing near the cabins, everything went wrong without anyone noticing. Mrs. Carter clapped and told us to get water. No one counted us. No one noticed that Mark wasn't there anymore. Mark had been behind me the whole hike, complaining about his shoes. I went to the bench with Daniel and the boy. Up close, I saw his shoes were muddy in a way ours weren't, like he'd been standing in deeper ground. I asked him if he liked camp. He nodded slowly and said yes, but his voice sounded like he was repeating something he'd heard. During lunch, counselors moved around with clipboards, but still no one counted us. Mark's seat was empty. The boy took it without asking. I felt sick watching him sit where Mark always did, tearing his bread the same way, staring at the same spot on the table. I finally told Mrs. Carter that Mark was missing. She frowned, checked her list, and said Mark had gone home early. I knew that wasn't true. Mark cried when his mom dropped him off. He wouldn't leave. I said so. She told me to stop making stories. After lunch, the boy followed me everywhere. When I went to the restroom, he waited outside. When I joined crafts, he sat beside me, copying my movements. I started to notice he didn't blink much. When he did, it was slow, like he was practicing. I asked him his name again. He told me it was Mark. My chest felt tight. I said no, Mark was my friend, and he was taller. The boy frowned, like I'd corrected him on something important. He said names change when you get lost, very calmly. That afternoon, the counselors finally realized someone was missing, but they said it was Daniel. Daniel was standing right there. The lists didn't match anymore. Names were scratched out, rewritten. Every time someone said Mark, they pointed at the boy. Every time I said Mark, no one listened. A search started, but it felt fake, like they already knew they wouldn't find anyone. The boy stayed in camp while we called out Mark's name. He corrected us softly, saying his name was Mark, over and over, until Mrs. Carter told him to be quiet. That night I couldn't sleep. The boy lay in the bunk across from mine. I whispered Mark's name into the dark, hoping my real friend would answer. The boy whispered back, closer than he should have been, saying he was already there and always had been. I got out of bed and shook Mrs. Carter awake. I told her the boy wasn't right. She followed me back, tired and annoyed. When she pulled the blanket down, the bunk was empty. The boy was gone. So was Mark's bag and his name on every list. The next morning, the counselors said everything was fine. They said camp had always had 4 kids in our group. They showed us photos. In every picture, the boy was there instead of Mark. Even in the one from the first day. My head hurt looking at them. I went home early. I told my parents everything. They called the camp. The camp said no child was missing. Mark's family never filed a report because they didn't remember having a son. Years later, I found Mark's name carved into a tree near the trail. Fresh. I still know what happened. Something took my friend and learned how to be him badly, then left once it was believed. It didn't need to stay. It needed to be counted. And now, whenever I'm in a group, I count everyone myself every single time. I was leaning over the radio log, pencil between my teeth, when the static snapped loud enough to make me flinch. And I remember being annoyed more than anything because I had just settled into the quiet rhythm of the night shift. I reached over, adjusted the dial, and said my call sign out of habit, expecting the usual nothing. Instead, through the hiss, a voice broke through, strained and urgent, saying there was an active fire with spot flare-ups and requesting immediate confirmation of coordinates. I straightened up, heart picking up speed, and asked them to repeat. The voice did, clearer this time, listing coordinates that made my stomach tighten because they were wrong. Not wrong as in inaccurate, but wrong as in old. I recognized them from training binders, fires from decades earlier, already extinguished, already written off. I told the radio there was no active fire at that location. The static swallowed my words, then the voice came back softer, almost tired, saying they were standing by for visual confirmation from the tower. I stood and walked to the window, scanning the dark like I always did, slow and methodical. Nothing, no glow, no smoke, nothing to justify the call. I reported clear conditions. The radio went silent. I logged the incident, writing, false signal, and underlining it once. My hand shook just enough for me to notice. 20 minutes later, the static returned. This time the voice didn't identify itself. It just said, "We have eyes on the tower," and gave the same outdated fire name I'd read about in old reports. I laughed once, sharp and nervous, and said that was impossible. The reply came back immediate, stating my exact elevation and the condition of the railing outside, details no one should have been able to see or know. I told myself someone was playing a sick joke, maybe a crossed signal from another region. I switched frequencies. The static followed me. I turned the radio off. The silence felt heavier than the noise. After a minute, the radio clicked back on by itself, the volume knob unmoved, and the voice said my name, not my call sign, my actual name. I demanded to know who was transmitting. The response was calm, procedural, like someone reading from a checklist. They said they were reporting from the fire line and needed confirmation that the tower was still operational. I said of course it was. I was standing in it. The voice paused, then said that according to their records, the tower had been lost during containment. I felt cold then, like the air had thinned without warning. I flipped through the old binders stacked under the desk, pages brittle and yellowed. I found the fire. The year was 1963. The notes mentioned a sudden wind shift, a tower overrun, communications lost. No survivors listed. I slammed the binder shut and told the radio to stop. I said they were confusing records. I said this wasn't funny anymore. The voice crackled, weaker now, and said the fire was moving uphill faster than expected. They asked if I could see it. I went back to the window, even though I didn't want to. For a second, I thought I saw something, a faint pulse in the dark, but it was gone before I could focus. I said no. The reply came back broken, cutting in and out. saying they couldn't see the lake anymore, that the smoke was too thick. I realized then that every description they gave matched the old reports exactly. Same phrasing, same sequence of events. I was listening to something replaying itself, or maybe finishing something it never got to finish. The radio suddenly blared coordinates again. This time, they were my exact position, the tower. They asked me to evacuate. I told them there was nowhere to go. They said they knew. They said the road would be blocked. They asked me to stay on the line so they wouldn't be alone. I didn't know what to say to that. I sat on the floor, radio in my lap, and listened as the voice described heat that wasn't there, flames I couldn't see, fear I could hear anyway. Then the transmission changed. The voice steadied and said the fire had passed. They asked for a final status report from the tower. I understood then what they needed. I keyed the mic and reported conditions clear, structure standing, no casualties. The radio hissed softly, like a sigh. The voice thanked me. The signal faded. The radio never did that again. I finished the season without another incident. When I turned in my logs, the supervisor paused at that entry and said it must have been interference. I didn't argue. I didn't go back the next year. Later, I requested the full historical file. The last recorded transmission from that fire ended mid-sentence, asking the tower for confirmation. It was never answered. I answered it. That's the only way I can make sense of it. Whatever happened that night didn't want to scare me. It wanted to be heard. And once it finally stopped calling. I was tightening the last bolt on a damaged switchback sign when I noticed the trail marker was closer to camp than it should have been, and the thought hit me so sharply I stopped mid-turn. That marker had been my reference point all week, a red blaze mounted into solid rock nearly 3 miles down the ridge. I knew it the way you know furniture in your own house. Seeing it uphill from where I remembered made my stomach tense, but I told myself I was tired and packed up for the night. When I walked back into camp, I checked my map again, tracing the trail with my finger. The marker was marked exactly where I remembered. I even laughed at myself a second, guessing something so basic. I cooked 8 and tried to shake the feeling that something small had shifted without my permission. That night, before sleeping, I stepped out of my tent and looked downslope. The marker stood there, faint but visible, closer than yesterday. The next morning I hiked down to it immediately. The bolts were still embedded deep in the rock, rusted and stubborn, exactly as they had been for years. There were no scrape marks, no sign it had been pried loose. I put my hand on it, grounding myself, and felt stupid for letting it get to me. When I hiked back up to camp, I took careful note of every turn. The marker was not supposed to be visible from camp. That was the point. That evening it was visible again. Not by much, but enough that I didn't have to squint. I stood there for a long time, trying to calculate angles, slope, light. I told myself the trail bent more than I remembered. I told myself the forest played tricks on depth. I slept badly. Waking every time, I thought I heard footsteps on gravel. On the 3rd day, I didn't work. I spent the morning pacing between the tent and the map board, comparing notes, checking my compass. When I finally walked down to the marker, it was unmistakably closer, not yards, hundreds of feet. The rock face behind it was different. I knew that rock. I had leaned against it before. This was not it. My hands shook as I tested the bolts again. Still solid. I looked around for drag marks, broken brush, anything. There was nothing. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to move the marker while leaving everything else untouched. I felt watched then, not by something with eyes, but by something attentive, patient. I reported it over the radio. The response was polite, skeptical. They suggested vandalism. They suggested I was mistaken. I didn't argue. I knew how it sounded. That night, I sat outside my tent until my legs went numb, staring downslope. The marker reflected my headlamp back at me from even closer than before. I slept with my boots on. Sometime before dawn, I woke with the certainty that something had changed again. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see movement. But I knew. When I unzipped the tent, the marker stood directly outside, planted in the dirt like it had always belonged there. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just stared at it, close enough to touch. Its red paint chipped exactly the way I remembered. I knelt and examined the base. The bolts were gone. Instead, the post ended in a rough, splintered point, as if it had grown that way. I felt a strange pull then, an urge to pick it up and carry it somewhere else. That scared me more than anything. I stepped back and packed without thinking, hands moving on their own. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed something carved into the back of the marker. Words I had never seen before. They were shallow, uneven, like someone learning to write. They said, TSWEO Yestero PDLOG. I left the marker there. I didn't take it. I didn't knock it over. I hiked out fast, not running, but not stopping either. When I reached the trailhead, I looked back one last time. The marker was gone. The report I filed was brief. They closed the trail for maintenance and sent someone else. Weeks later, I heard they found the marker back where it belonged, bolted into the original rock. No sign it had ever moved. They said I must have been confused. I didn't argue. I know what I saw. I know what followed me Uftil, night after night, until I noticed it. I've learned something since then. Some markers aren't there to guide you forward. They're there to measure how far you're allowed to go before something decides you've gone far enough. I was washing the last mug at the sink when the knocking started, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the trees behind the house, and my first thought was irritation because it was late and no one ever came up that road without calling first. I dried my hands, glanced down the hallway toward Mrs. Ellison's bedroom, and listened. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more not at the door. Not on the wall. Somewhere outside. Deeper than the porch. I stepped into her room to check on her. She was awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling like she often did when she couldn't sleep. Before I could say anything, she said, "Don't answer it." Her voice was steady, not frightened. That unsettled me more than if she'd been shaking. I told her it was probably someone lost, maybe a neighbor. She turned her head and looked straight at me. "They don't knock to be helped," she said. "They knock to be counted." The knocking came again, same rhythm, same distance. I felt a prickle run up my arms. I asked her what she meant, trying to keep my tone light. She told me she'd lived there 40 years and had heard it 7 times. Each time, someone inside the house died within a day. Her husband, her sister, a hired man. She listed them like items on a grocery receipt. I laughed, because that's what you do when something feels too heavy to accept, and told her she was scaring herself. She didn't laugh back. She reached out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "If you answer it," she said, "it won't be me this time." That shut me up. I pulled my hand free gently and told her to rest while I checked outside. She shook her head. "If you look at it," she said, "it will look back." I told myself she was confused. She had good days and bad days. This was just a bad night. I went to the back door anyway. I didn't open it. I just stood there listening. The knocking had stopped. The silence felt intentional, like something waiting. I turned on the porch light. Nothing moved. Trees, fence, empty, dark. I told myself I was being ridiculous and locked the door. When I turned around, Mrs. Ellison was standing in the hallway behind me. She hadn't made a sound getting out of bed. That scared me more than the knocking. She looked smaller out there, wrapped in her robe, eyes sharp. "Now it knows you heard it," she said. I guided her back to bed, my heart racing, and stayed with her until she fell asleep. I told myself I would report this to her daughter in the morning and laugh about it later. The knocking started again just after midnight. Same pattern. 3. Pause. 3. This time it was closer. Not at the house, but nearer than before. I sat on the couch, phone in my hand, debating calling someone and realizing how stupid it would sound. I checked on Mrs. Ellison. She was breathing shallowly, eyes open again. She smiled when she saw my face. "It's early," she said. "That's new." I asked her why she thought it happened. She said the land remembered who belonged on it and who was only passing through. When I asked how she knew it wasn't just coincidence, she told me the knocks always came before the body gave up, not after. Like a warning bell rung too late to matter. I didn't want to hear any more, but I couldn't stop listening. Around 3 in the morning, the knocking moved to the side of the house. I could hear it clearly now. Wood on wood, but not on any door or window. It was like someone tapping the air itself. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to hide or run or do something. Ellison called my name softly from her room. When I went to her, she was crying without sound. "It's choosing," she whispered. I told her I was leaving, that I would call an ambulance, that this was too much. She nodded. "That's fair," she said. "It doesn't mind if you go. It only minds if you answer." I grabbed my bag, hands clumsy, and headed for the front door. Before I reached it, the knocking stopped completely. The silence pressed in so hard my ears rang. My phone buzzed. A message from her daughter asking how the night was going. I didn't answer. I stood there, staring at the door, feeling like something was standing just outside my chest instead of the house. From the back of the hallway, I heard Mrs. Ellison call out, "Someone's at the door." Her voice sounded wrong, stretched thin. I ran to her room. She was standing again, one hand on the bed, the other pointing toward the back. "It's knocking," she said. I couldn't hear anything. I told her there was nothing there. She looked confused, then relieved. She sat down slowly. "Then it's decided," she said. She lay back and closed her eyes. She died before morning. "Peacefully," the doctor said. "Natural causes." I didn't mention the knocking. I quit that job a week later. I don't stay in houses near woods anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I hear knocking far away, never close enough to answer. And I don't, because I believe her. Whatever does the knocking doesn't want the door, it wants permission. I was halfway up the access ladder inside the tower when the first knock came from above me, sharp and metallic. And my immediate reaction was anger, because no one was supposed to be anywhere near the structure during a storm call-out. I stopped climbing, one boot braced, and shouted that the site was closed, expecting no answer. Instead, the knock came again, slower this time, directly over my head, vibrating down the ladder rails into my hands. I checked my radio and called dispatch, telling them someone was on the tower. They told me no one had been cleared for ascent, no air support was flying, and weather conditions made climbing impossible. I told them I could hear someone above me. There was a pause before they asked if I was certain. I said yes, and because the third knock came immediately after, precise and deliberate. I climbed higher despite every instinct telling me not to. The knocking didn't move away or closer. It stayed just out of sight, always above the next platform. When I reached the first service deck, I pulled myself over the edge and stood shaking, scanning the metal framework. No one was there, no harness, no boots, no rope. The structure swayed slightly, enough to remind me how exposed I was. I told dispatch again that I couldn't see anyone. They told me to descend and wait it out. I agreed, turned, and froze when something knocked from above once more, directly overhead, exactly where the next ladder section began. The sound wasn't random. It was controlled, intentional. Someone knocking where I would have to look up. I backed away from the ladder and crouched, my heart hammering. I yelled again, demanding to know who was there. A voice answered, muffled by wind and metal, saying my name. Not my last name, my first. I demanded identification. The voice said it was a maintenance check. I told them they were lying. The voice corrected me calmly, saying they were early. My radio crackled as dispatch told me there was interference. I asked them if they could hear the knocking. They said no. As if to prove a point, the knocking started again, faster now, traveling down the tower in measured intervals, like someone descending rung by rung. I scrambled backward, nearly slipping, and pressed myself against the railing. The voice spoke again, closer. It said the storm had changed schedules, that inspections were overdue, that safety protocols required confirmation from the inside. I told it I was already inside. It paused, then knocked directly above my head, hard enough to rattle bolts. Then open, it said. I don't know why I answered it. Maybe because I was trained to comply. Maybe because fear makes you follow rules even when they don't apply. I told it there was nothing to open, that this was a tower. The voice replied that everything had an inside if you climbed far enough. The knocking stopped. For several seconds there was only wind and my own breathing. I told dispatch I was coming down. They told me to do it slowly. As I reached for the ladder, something tapped the railing beside my hand. Not above, beside. I recoiled and saw a set of knuckles rap the metal once more, deliberate and patient, emerging from empty air. I screamed then. I didn't care who heard. I backed away until there was nowhere left to go. The voice sounded disappointed. It said records showed someone had failed to complete a final inspection years earlier, and unfinished tasks caused instability. It said it was here to verify closure. I told it to leave. I told it this wasn't real. The voice said real was a matter of access. It knocked again, softer, almost polite. I realized then it wasn't trying to scare me. It was waiting for acknowledgement, like a process stalled without confirmation. I forced myself to speak clearly and said the tower was operational, inspected, secure. I listed serial numbers. I recited procedures from memory. The knocking slowed, then stopped. The voice asked me to confirm verbally. I did. My throat burned as I finished. The wind picked up, and for a moment the structure felt empty again. Dispatch came back on the radio asking if I was safe. I said yes, and this time it felt true. I descended without hearing another sound. At the base, I looked up. Nothing moved except the tower itself. The storm passed. The logs showed no anomalies, no interference. Weeks later, reviewing archives, I found an incident report from decades earlier. A technician trapped during severe weather. Last transmission incomplete, inspection never closed. I added a final note to the system, marking it resolved. Since then, no one has reported knocks from above, and I never climb without closing every task. I was sitting on the cold metal bench by the playground fence, kicking my heels and watching the last festival lights blink off, when the laughter started again behind me. It didn't sound close, but it wasn't far either, and it didn't sound like grown-ups. I told myself my mom would be back any minute, that she always ran late talking to people, and that I was too old to be scared of a playground. I turned around anyway. The swings were moving slow and steady, even though no one was sitting on them. There were 3 swings, and each one creaked at a different rhythm. At first I thought the sounds were just metal, but then I realized the creaks were shaped like voices. One swing sounded like giggling, breathy and fast. Another sounded like someone trying not to laugh, choking it back. The third swing made a slower sound, low and dragging, like a kid laughing after crying. My stomach tightened because I knew those laughs. They weren't exact, but they reminded me of kids I'd played with earlier that day. I stood up, the bench scraping loud, and said hello. The laughter stopped all at once. The swings kept moving. I walked closer, my shoes crunching gravel, and felt like I was doing something wrong just by stepping onto the playground. I told myself it was just echoes from the festival, sound carrying weird in the dark. Then the laughter started again, but this time the voices were clearer. The giggle swing sounded like a girl named Emily who had shared her cotton candy with me. My chest felt tight when I realized Emily had left hours ago. I whispered her name without meaning to. The swing answered by creaking faster, like it was happy to be noticed. I backed away, shaking my head, telling myself to stop. I turned toward the road, expecting to see my mom's car, but the street was empty. Behind me, the swings creaked in a pattern, like they were taking turns. I heard my own name then, soft and careful. It came from the slow swing. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. I hadn't told anyone my name at the playground. I said stop, my voice cracking, and covered my ears. The laughter didn't get louder, but it got closer, like it was leaning toward me. The swings slowed until they were almost still. Then one by one, they stopped, and the playground felt empty again. I stood there breathing fast, counting to 10 the way my teacher taught us. When I opened my eyes, a woman was walking toward me from the road. It was my mom. I ran to her and started crying so hard I couldn't talk. She hugged me and asked what happened. I told her the swings were laughing. She looked back at the playground. The swings were still. She told me I was tired and picked me up. As we walked away, I heard one last creak, soft and sad. Years later, I found out 3 kids from that town died young. Emily was one of them. Another fell into the river. The third was hit by a car after a festival. I still don't know how the playground knew. I just know it remembers the kids who never went home. And sometimes, if you're alone long enough, it lets you hear them. I was standing beside the barricade adjusting the last reflective cone when the headlights appeared again inside the closed stretch. Glowing white and low in the fog, and my first thought was irritation because I had already radioed the closure twice and logged the time. I stepped closer to the edge of the pavement, raised my flashlight, and waited for the vehicle to slow. It didn't. It just kept coming steady, centered, never drifting, like it hadn't seen me at all. I clicked the radio and told dispatch I had an approaching car past the closure point. They answered calmly, said traffic cameras showed nothing moving in that section. I watched the headlights swell brighter, then stop, hanging there in the fog without advancing another inch. No engine sound followed. No tires, just light. I told myself it was fog playing tricks. Distance flattening, depth gone. I took 3 steps forward. The headlights stayed exactly where they were. I took 3 steps back. They stayed. My pulse climbed. I waved the flashlight again. The light didn't react. Dispatch asked if I was sure. I said yes, because I could feel the light on my face, a faint warmth, like a car idling just out of reach. I asked them to check again. They said the road was empty. The headlights blinked once. Not like a signal, like eyes. I backed toward the barricade and felt suddenly stupid for being scared of something so ordinary. Cars come through closures all the time. People ignore signs. I lifted the flashlight and shouted. My voice swallowed instantly. The light ahead brightened, then dimmed, like it was breathing. I remembered the briefing about this stretch, the way supervisors warned us about sudden pileups, cars vanishing into fog, the paperwork that followed. I had laughed then, called it mountain drama. Standing there, I wasn't laughing. The headlights began to move again, creeping forward just enough to make my stomach drop. I braced myself, ready to jump aside. They stopped short, always short. Like an invisible line had been drawn between us. I realized then they had never crossed the closure. They were trapped inside it. I radioed again, voice shaking now, and asked dispatch if any accidents had occurred earlier that night. There was a pause. Then they said there had been a multi-vehicle crash years earlier, same mile marker, heavy fog, chain reaction. Road closed overnight. Several fatalities. I felt cold. The headlights flickered, multiplied. Another set appeared behind the first, then another, lining the road with silent white points. None moved closer. None turned away. I was suddenly aware of how alone I was, how thin my reflective vest felt against whatever was happening. I told dispatch I was leaving the barricade. They told me to stay put. I told them I couldn't. As I turned, the lights surged brighter, pressing against the fog, like they were trying to reach me before I went. I ran to the truck, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice. From inside the cab, I watched the headlights hold their line. One by one, they dimmed, fading until the road was empty again. Dispatch came back, asking if I still saw anything. I said no. I finished the shift in silence. The next morning, I filed a report. It was marked equipment malfunction, fog distortion. I didn't argue. I requested reassignment. They approved it quickly. Years later, I drove that stretch in daylight. There is a small memorial near the shoulder. Multiple names. Same mile marker. I don't work overnight closures anymore, and when I see headlights in fog, I always make sure they reach me. I was unlocking the maintenance office at dawn when I realized the cabin key was missing. And the thought landed heavy because that key never left my ring unless I logged it. I stood there listening to the door click shut behind me, patting my pockets, checking the desk, telling myself I must have set it down. The radio crackled with routine chatter, and I forced myself to breathe normally while writing a missing key report. Losing a key meant protocol, paperwork, and questions, and I hated questions. I searched the office slowly, deliberately, as if moving too fast might confirm something worse. When I finally sat at the desk, the empty hook where the key belonged felt like an accusation I could not answer. I finished the report, signed my name, and stepped out to start the morning checks, still irritated with myself. The cabins were quiet, as expected, and I unlocked each one with the master ring, noting nothing unusual. Cabin 7 was last, the one closest to the tree line, and the missing key was supposed to hang there. I locked the door with the spare and wrote a note to replace it later. As I turned back toward the office, I felt watched in that vague way you feel alone too long. I dismissed it because forests do that to you, and went back inside to file paperwork. I reminded myself procedures existed for reasons, even when nothing felt immediately wrong, and boredom often sharpened anxiety. That afternoon, I returned from the trail and froze in the doorway, because the missing key was sitting on the desk. It lay perfectly straight on the blotter, teeth aligned, tag facing up, exactly how I kept things. For a moment, I felt relief so strong it made me dizzy. Then I saw the tag. It was not the laminated label I had written. It was an old paper tag, yellowed, with a ranger name printed in faded ink, and a date written beneath it. The date was a death date. I recognized the name from orientation stories, a ranger who vanished years before I was hired. My hands shook as I picked it up, already knowing no one should have had it anywhere nearby. I checked the logbooks immediately, flipping pages too fast, searching for an explanation that fit rules I understood. The name matched a ranger assigned to these cabins decades earlier. Last seen during a routine inspection. The official file said missing, presumed dead, body never recovered. I sat down hard, staring at the key, remembering I had locked the office myself that morning. No one had signed in. No vehicle tracks led up the service road. I radioed the district office, reported the key found, and hesitated before mentioning the tag. Silence stretched on the line before the supervisor told me to secure it and wait. I placed the key in an envelope, sealed it, and left it on the desk with shaking, unwilling hands alone. I did not leave. Curiosity mixed with dread kept me rooted to the chair, eyes fixed on the envelope. Hours passed without sound beyond the building settling. Near evening, I stepped outside to clear my head and returned minutes later. The envelope was gone. The key lay on the desk again, same careful placement, same tag. Now with another detail. Beneath the date was a location note matching a bend in the trail I had checked that morning. I felt cold certainty settle in. This was not a mistake or a prank. Something was communicating using procedure I respected. I knew that bend well, because it marked where the path disappeared briefly from maps, and where the old ranger had last reported unofficially speaking. I went to the bend at first light, following protocol as comfort rather than obligation. The spot felt ordinary, which made it worse. I searched carefully and found nothing except disturbed leaves near a shallow drop. There were no remains, no tools, nothing to close a case. Back at the office, the key waited on the desk again. This time the tag included my own name written lightly beneath the ranger's. My breath caught so hard my chest hurt. I understood then what the key was. It was not a threat. It was a record of custody being transferred. Someone needed the key to be acknowledged before they could finally be done, and the responsibility frightened me more than any imagined danger ever could alone. I called the district office and requested a formal transfer, explaining everything without embellishment. They did not laugh. Records showed the ranger's file still open, unresolved. By acknowledging the key, I had closed it administratively. The supervisor told me to return the key to storage and update the registry. When I placed it back on the hook, the tag crumbled in my fingers, paper turning to dust. The key itself felt heavier, final. That night, for the first time, the cabin nearest the trail felt empty instead of expectant, and I slept without listening for footsteps. The forest remained unchanged, but something unfinished within it had finally settled completely, and the quiet felt earned rather than tense or watchful anymore after many long seasons passing. I stayed another year in that position, doing my job carefully, never losing another key. The story followed me quietly, shared in lowered voices, stripped of the details that mattered. People wanted it to be a ghost story. It was not. It was a system correcting itself through someone patient enough to notice. I learned that places keep ledgers the way offices do, marking what is owed and what is returned. When I left the service, I felt no fear of that cabin, only respect, and a certainty that some duties outlast the people assigned to them. The key taught me that endings sometimes require witnesses rather than force or explanation, and that quiet acknowledgement can be the most powerful closure available to forgotten histories. I never saw the ranger, never heard a voice, and that matters to me. Nothing demanded belief, only attention. The key returned because it had nowhere else to go. By reporting it missing, I created a space for it to come back correctly. That is the part people miss when I tell them now. They want fear. What I felt was responsibility settling into place. When I passed through Tellico Plains, I still glanced toward the trees, not expecting anything, just acknowledging what remains accounted for and what no longer needs me. Some stories end loudly, but this one ended with a ledger balanced at last, and a man learning that care can sometimes outlive fear itself in quiet, unnoticed ways over long years afterward. I am telling you this because you asked why I still log everything, even small losses. Objects remember where they belong. So do responsibilities. If you ever find something returned that should not be, look at how it is presented. That matters more than how it arrived. I did not inherit a haunting. I inherited a conclusion. The ranger stayed missing in the woods, but his duty did not. It waited patiently for someone to notice the gap and fill it properly. When I locked the office for the last time, the hook stayed empty, and that felt right. Some endings are not about answers, only about leaving nothing unresolved behind and allowing the living to continue without carrying unfinished obligations forward into ordinary days.